Hey, Chris.
Yes, Victor.
We have a couple thank yous we'd like to give out today.
Oh, I love it when we do thank yous.
Yeah, this is for our patrons on Patreon.
I love our patrons on Patreon.
So our first one is Kada Awin. Thank you, Kada.
Thank you, Kada.
And our second one
is Sarah Odes.
Thank you, Sarah.
And thank you, listeners.
Thanks.
You're listening to Civil Dissonance,
a show where we explore, engage, and dissect the topics that divide us as a society.
Today on Civil Dissonance, we'll be discussing
right-to-work laws and the condition of unions. Hey, Chris.
Yes, Victor.
I think our state was in the news again.
I know our state was in the news again.
What was our state in the news again for?
Well, maybe for something more positive than just being
heroin capital of the world.
Or prescription abusers, whatever. The teachers' work stoppage.
Yes, very exciting.
Yeah.
And I think we finally came to a conclusion with that.
It is over, yes.
And my daughter's back in school.
She is. And my wife is back to teaching.
So we have to figure out exactly what was going on with all that.
Well, I don't think that's exactly what this episode is about.
Well, I think it's, what is organized labor? What is unions? What are...
That's what this one's about.
Yeah.
So the whole thing with that was, the teachers' unions, and I believe there's 2 teachers' unions in the state of West Virginia that assisted with the work stoppage, helped broker the deal with the state legislature and the governor.
Go on.
Well, I was kind of hoping you'd jump in.
Well,
unions in that instance played a very big part. And it wasn't just for the teachers. It was all state employees. And I think that's very important to remember. Even though the teachers were in the news, it was all state employees that the teachers were doing a work stoppage for.
And I think that kind of got blocked out in the media.
It did.
In the media attention.
It did. And I think it did, but only because the teachers were present, but they were the only ones that could be present. They had the ability to be present.
Yeah, they make a greater visual impact. And not just a visual impact. I mean, if the kids don't go to school, then you have to figure out where your kids are going to go during the day, and that affects the entire economy of the state. So it was a bold move that I think had to be done. It was the only way they could address an issue that's, about the income gaps here in West Virginia. I think it was a bold, powerful move.
Yeah. And since we're going to be talking about right to work laws, did you know that West Virginia was a right to work state?
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, it really is.
I wonder, so what do you think a right to work law is?
So I know in a previous episode with Dr. Waterhouse, we had discussed briefly right to work laws, and he talked about, how that started. And I didn't realize that it had started in the 40s with the Taft-Hartley Act. So maybe we should delve into that a little bit, maybe get some more information.
Yeah, we're going to need someone smarter than us to do that one, though.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's not just the right to work laws, but what are unions? What are the things that labor, I guess it started as a labor movement, but, what are all these little things that they have for collective bargaining and things like that? What are those?
I don't really hear about unions all that much anymore.
Well, when I was a kid, I remember that, we're talking young, unions were very well, I don't want to say they were very well thought of, but you could definitely tell they were more pronounced. And they definitely had a more positive image. And it just felt like over the years, they sort of declined. Maybe they sort of had a different understanding of what they were, at least in the public eye. And they got more of a dirty name. And I think that sort of carried over. But I think we lost a little something in the ability to speak for ourselves.
Or have the labor force, the working force, have a voice. In my mind, that's what a union is. It's a representation legally and with some sort of backing for the workers, for the labor force.
But in some instances, I don't think it is legal. At least on paper anyway, right?
Unions?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily unions, but to strike versus in Stoppage, and I mean there was some chatter in the media about arresting teachers and things like that.
That would have been interesting to see.
Yeah, no one would have gone with it.
No.
But, there's different levels that these things function at. And, what's considered, this is our best bet to being legal. A legal way of vying for our rights as workers.
So, with unions on the mind, I remember when I was a younger person, much younger, coming into adulthood, I remember working for a couple companies, and I remember it not being a written policy, but it was highly discouraged to the point where they would terminate your employment if you even started to discuss unionizing.
Well, that doesn't seem very legal.
No, but did you ever experience that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've definitely experienced that. So there's a lot of places I've worked where if you just don't mention it in public, I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I wonder how many of you listeners have experienced that. Maybe let us know in the comments or on our Facebook page.
Yeah,
or
definitely
on our Twitter.
Definitely shout it out and tag us on our social media.
Yeah, definitely. So, Victor, I believe it's time.
All right, I'm gonna go find us an expert.
Okay.
All right. Our guest today is Dr. Raymond Hogler. Dr. Hogler teaches labor relations and human resource management at Colorado State University, where he also earned his PhD and JD degree. He's certified as a labor arbitrator by the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service and has written several books, including The End of American Labor Unions, The Right to Work Movement, and The Erosion of Collective Bargaining. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Hogler.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, can you tell us a little about yourself, other than what I've mentioned? What some of your hobbies are and things like that?
Yes, basically a little bit about my background. You mentioned that I was an arbitrator. I have a law degree and I practiced in the field of labor relations for several years. Then I went to Penn State University where I taught in their labor relations department and came to Colorado State. My hobbies basically are physical exercise like running, and I've done a number of marathons, Marine Corps Marathon, Boston Marathon, a few things like that. So I try to stay in shape and I try to stay mentally fit as well. And I do that by writing books and articles.
Okay, well, jumping right in, I was wondering if you could tell us about, what is collective bargaining and why is it important?
Collective bargaining is merely a group of workers who engage in concerted activity to deal with their employer. And the theory behind that, and has been for many years in this country, is that individual employees don't have sufficient power to deal with an employer on a basis of parity or equality. So if they form into a collective group, they have much better success at that. And the reason that's important is because in this country, I think there's a tendency generally for our system to work toward inequality of wealth. During the period of the 1950s to the 1980s, inequality of wealth was at a lower point, the lowest point in really many years modern history of the United States. And that was due to collective bargaining, and that began to reverse itself in the 1980s. What you see since then is rising inequality.
Can you give us a little bit more of the history of unions and collective bargaining in the United States? Yeah,
sure. Really, unions have been around for a long time, but the modern impetus for them came during the Depression and the enactment of the National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act as it's sometimes called, in 1935. That was a basic recognition by the federal government that workers should have rights to organize, they should be protected in collective bargaining, and that it would be good for the country, and that proved to be true. Immediately after in the post-war era, this roughly after World War II until up to the turn of the century, workers in this country did fairly well because unions were relatively much stronger than they are now. So it worked the way Wagner predicted it would work.
I know in your book you discuss a relationship between unions and the middle class. Can you tell our listeners how the unions have helped shape the American middle class?
I think they were crucial to the shaping of the American middle class. In that post-war era, when other nations, other industrialized countries were suffering a tremendous economic setback because of the war, American industry was able to step in and basically become the powerhouse of the world. At that time, collective bargaining was also very strong. And during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, collective bargaining helped to redistribute the productive wealth. So the American economy was booming, productivity was high, and workers were sharing in that prosperity. There are some great stories about workers now. A guy who retired from a packing plant in Iowa started work during this period of time, and he said, I had 2 cars. I could take my kids on vacation. I could send them to college. He said, but workers now, they don't have a chance at that because wages have fallen relatively flat for many years.
Yeah, we live in West Virginia where the basic income is pretty much below what would be considered lower middle class. And you see that all the time. If there's even a bump in the road, you sort of get, you fall into a pothole. It's not just a bump in the road anymore. And it just doesn't feel like I'm sorry.
I was going to add that when I worked at Penn State, I was an arbitrator on the United Mine Workers of America panel, District 31, which the area was around Fairmont. So I used to go down to West Virginia to do arbitrations. I'm perfectly familiar with what you're talking about.
Are you familiar with Matewan and the events that occurred around there?
Yes, I am. Best movie of the 1980s.
Can you elaborate on Matewan for us a little bit?
Sure. Matewan was a story about a coal strike. I think the great thing about it also encapsulates this feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. And I think that's relevant in showing just the amount of conflict or the degree of conflict that sometimes comes in this conflict between workers and owners in the United States. And that movie encapsulated it perfectly. Roger Ebert said it was the best movie of the 1980s.
I know there are economists who state that the middle class is shrinking. With that in mind, do you see a correlation between deunionization and wealth inequality?
That's absolutely the correlation, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of research and a lot of commentary on this, but I think as unions began to decline, roughly beginning in around the 1980s, and I personally date the event to be 1978, when labor made a push politically to try to restore labor law to some semblance of favoritism toward workers. And by that, I simply mean they tried to restore the idea that workers had a right to collective bargaining. This was a labor reform act. It was defeated by 2 guys. One of them was Orrin Hatch, and the other was Richard Lugar from Indiana. These 2 led a filibuster, which after, I don't know how many cloture votes, I think there were 15 or 16, they finally gave up and declared the labor law reform was dead. And when that happened, I think many people in this country, employers and even labor leaders, looked at that and said, this is a terrible defeat for labor. And truly, it has been downhill ever since.
I know here in West Virginia, and it just feels like in other places, the unions sort of got a bad reputation there for a while. Can you elaborate on that? Why people feel that way?
And it's unfortunate. I mean, these things have happened periodically in the United States. Take 1894. Eugene Debs leads a strike against the railroads and have brought down the national railway system. Because employers have the ability to publicize their views much more effectively than workers, all of this was pinned on Debs and labor unions, and they fell into disrepute. That's been something that's happened in this country over and over and over again. When these labor disputes go bad, I mean, when somebody is injured, when somebody suffers a severe loss of life or property, it usually gets pinned on labor. And in 1980, in the air traffic controller strike, I'm not defending Reagan and I'm not condemning him. He was quite forceful in dealing with the air traffic controllers, but it's also true they were engaged in an illegal strike. But that incident in and of itself, I think, put labor in a very poor light, mainly because Reagan was such a popular figure. And when he did that, people applauded him for standing up to unions. And they were painted as being these kind of corrupt special interest groups. And that's been historically true. I think it's still true today. You see people talking about unions in the same terminology.
So you think there's a spin factor on it that they're using?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a cultural thing. I think Americans, well, as you know, they're very much divided about certain things like Trump and Clinton. These political divisions, they underlie, or I think they're manifestations of a very deep cultural division. And that cultural division has to do with our attitudes toward collectivism or individualism. And that's evident in these labor disputes. People who don't believe that workers should be engaged in collectivism, that is, they should deal with their employers on a basis of individualism, they're opposed to unions.
In Mate 1, didn't the detectives believe that unions were communism or something like that? Didn't they believe there was like a branch of communism?
Right. And if you remember in that movie, Chris Cooper, who I think is one of the best actors at work today, Chris Cooper plays an organizer, a union organizer, and he talks about being a member of the Wobblies. Now, the Wobblies were this very radical group who wanted to do away with the wage system and private property and capitalism and all of that stuff and substitute this very radical socialism. So it's easy to see how unions get tagged with this idea that they're somehow antithetical to basic American values. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a basic American value too, which is to try to protect people who need protection and not leave everything to the mine owners or the operators. And that's what Mate 1 was about, in my opinion.
Agreed. I mean, it was very, it's a very interesting little piece of history. And then, it's to take place in such a small section of almost a lost section of the country. It's amazing to me, Yes.
And I think that area of the country down there in Appalachia, right on that tip, it's sort of an overlooked area because people they may think about Virginia and the East Coast being relatively prosperous, but those areas dominated by mining and extractive industries, that was an area where there was a lot of conflict, not only Mate 1, but the coalfield wars in Mingo. All of that stuff happened, and I think it just is reflective of, indeed, in the coal strike, which took place partly in Virginia. I think it was part of that same tradition, the more recent one. I'm not sure which one it was, but they called out the state police in Virginia to sort of monitor that, and so it goes on.
So, in a previous episode, we discussed that lobbying, specifically lobbying for corporate interest, played into a decline of unions and the increase in the wealth gap. Do you see corporate lobbying as having a role in this?
Well, I would say lobbyists. I mean, looking at it broadly, you have the Koch brothers who run this network and who extend their influence very deeply into American politics through the American Legislative Exchange Council and other groups. There's some nice writings on the Koch brothers and just how deep they go. Their father, Fred, was a member of the John Birch Society. So they have a long history of this kind of activity. And they are the sponsors, if you will, of this right-wing conspiracy, as Clinton called it, that really does exist, I think, and it exists to promote the interest of capitalists in this country. It's not necessarily to do away with unions, but they perceive unions to be one of the pillars of support of the Democratic Party and therefore a political opponent.
I'm sorry, did you say the John Burke Society? Is that what you said?
John Burke Society, yes.
Can you elaborate on what that is?
Sure. The John Birch Society was this very, I'm going to use the word right wing, but they were extremely conservative. And they were very popular in this country for some period of time. The founder of the National Right to Work Committee, the person who was in charge of that for some period of time, his name right now escapes me. I think it's Mark Mix. In any event, these people were neighbors in Wichita, Kansas of the Kochs and the Koch family. So they're deeply intertwined and have been for many, many years. This sort of movement toward right to work and this movement toward conservative politics, you can trace back to the father of the Koch brothers and their father, who was very deeply attached to the John Birch Society, which was, I don't want to use the word fascist, but they were so right-wing and so extremely conservative that they looked almost like an oddity. I mean, they were a group that had very distinctive conservative views. So
and you had mentioned right to work here just a minute ago. Can you explain to our listeners what the right to work laws are?
Yes, right to work simply means that you have no obligation to provide compulsory dues to a union representative. It basically is a means whereby you can opt out of union activities. In many states, right to work means you don't even have to give a reason. So, for example, if there's a union representative, and I'm covered by a union contract where I work, say, at a Safeway store, in a right to work state, they can't make me join the union and pay dues. So it's a method of opting out of this collective support system. I get the benefits of it, but I don't have to pay for it. And that, by the way, is the essence of the Janus case, which is being touted, discussed very deep, very much. The decision, the argument was made to the Supreme Court just last week or several days ago. And the Supreme Court will decide this case for the public sector, whether or not union members can be made to pay compulsory dues. And if not, the entire public sector will become right to work.
Oh, wow. Can you tell our listeners what free riders are, since I think that's maybe going to be a little bit related to this, right?
Sure, it is. It's exactly related to it. That is a deep problem in our society, because we all participate in collective goods like roads and schools and everything else. So do we allow people to opt out of supporting those activities? And the answer generally is no, even though I don't have any children in a school district where I live now. I still have to pay taxes which support that school. That's my collective obligation. But if I were able to free ride, I could opt out of that obligation and send my kids to school without paying any taxes to support it. So there are many of these kind of organizations. I mean, they exist everywhere. Public radio is one of them. If you listen to public radio, they can't make you pay for that. But if you feel like you are part of that collective body, you will pay, you'll give money to public radio to keep it on the air. And that's what free riding means. Free riding is a mechanism whereby people opt out of engaging in a group collective activity, even though it benefits them and they get the benefit of it.
Do you think that a lot of people will opt out of that if they have the choice? And if so, what effect would that have on unionizing?
It has a terribly destructive impact on unionizing, mainly because they will opt out. That's been shown in these right-to-work states. Union membership density is lower. Union membership, the dues they're able to collect is much lower. They're weakened by that. And the right-to-work situation, it's fairly well established that all the adverse consequences for unions come into play much more heavily in a right-to-work state than in a union security state.
I was actually reading an article you wrote about the Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees case. And
yes.
You said they heard the case. Did they make any headway toward it, or did they just hear the arguments?
No, here's the problem. This is a long-standing matter before the Supreme Court, and Samuel Alito has been the guy who's trying to drive this union security issue before the full court. Back in 2012, I think it was, there was a case involving teachers that went before the court, and Alito wrote the opinion, and Alito said, in future cases, we are going to abolish public sector union security as a constitutional matter. You can opt in, but you're out unless you opt in. Then the Friedrichs case came before the court, I think in 2015. That looked like it was going to put the nail in labor's coffin. Unfortunately, the coffin turned out to be Antonin Scalia's. Scalia was going to vote in favor of union, in favor of right to work for public sector unions, and then he passed away. That left a 4-4 split, and this Friedrichs case came up, and the court divided on that. But since it was a 4-4 split, the lower court decision was upheld, which was in favor of unionism. Now the Janus case comes up. Neil Gorsuch is sitting on the court, and I think there's general consensus of opinion. Gorsuch is going to be with the 4 conservatives, and he's going to rule that you can't have compulsory dues in public sector unions.
So partisanship is playing a factor in all this.
You know, the interesting thing, I think, you watch Mitch McConnell when Obama put forward a moderate and a very good justice, Merrick Garland, very good judge. And Mitch McConnell for 11 months refused to have hearings. He refused to take up that appointment. I think that was an absolutely unhistorical moment. The Senate refusing to take up a judicial nomination. And so what happened is the thing sits there. McConnell is betting that Trump is going to win the election. Now, maybe against all odds, but he's thinking, if I just hold this up and by some miracle a Republican gets elected instead of Hillary Clinton, we'll be home free. We'll get a nominee we like. And just today, I heard Sarah Sanders, the press secretary for Trump, extol as one of his great virtues that he was able to put a nominee on the Supreme Court. The only way he did that is because of Mitch McConnell.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. What a world, right?
Yeah. Well, can you explain to us the Taft-Hartley Act?
Yes, I can. Basically, the Wagner Act in 1935 made unions much stronger. It was very favorable to unions. In 1946, Republicans were elected to Congress in overwhelming numbers. We had a Democratic president, Harry Truman, but in the 1946 election, Republicans took over Congress in such numbers that whatever Truman tried to do, they had the power to veto it. And Truman actually did veto the Taft-Hartley Act, and they overrode his veto. The Taft-Hartley Act was a product of this very conservative, heavily Republican Congress in 1946-47, who passed this law restricting and controlling the power of unions. It was designed in order to curb what they saw as excesses of unionism, that is, all these strikes, all this union power, the tremendous number of people who joined unions. Labor organizations become politically powerful. Taft-Hartley says we're going to undermine this, and they did that in various ways. But to my mind, the most destructive component of Taft-Hartley was this Section 14B, which said states can outlaw union security. All they have to do is vote on it. And what that led to was what are now 28 states have these right-to-work laws. Under the Wagner Act, you wanted to have compulsory union membership, you could do it. In fact, they had closed shops. You couldn't get a job unless you were a union member. Taft-Hartley undid all of that.
Well, actually, something I was wondering about the American middle class. Was the American middle class at its strongest at the same time unions were at its strongest?
I believe that's perfectly accurate to say, and as union power declines, middle class wealth declines. There's a guy named Thomas Piketty who studies this stuff extensively. He writes on inequality, massive book he just published dealing with the subject. He writes articles, shorter articles, op-ed pieces. You can find it everywhere. And Piketty he has a chart that shows you which tracks union membership and inequality in the United States. And those things track perfectly. As unions are strong, they're able to bargain for higher wages, inequality decreases. As unions become weaker, inequality increases. I think he shows that beyond dispute.
So have you heard about the work stoppage of teachers in West Virginia?
Yes, I have. I've been following it closely.
Sir, what are your thoughts, and do you think it'll have an effect on a larger scale outside of the state?
There's some discussion that teachers in Oklahoma may undertake a strike. That's also a state where teachers are poorly paid. You have to distinguish in this case between people who work for the government, so-called public sector workers, and people who work in private industry. Those people who work in private industry are covered by the National Labor Relations Act, a federal collective bargaining statute. Workers in the public sector, because the National Labor Relations Act exempted them from coverage, they're covered under state laws. Some states have very extensive laws regulating public sector bargaining, like Pennsylvania. Some states have no laws, like West Virginia. So it's kind of it's a toss-up. It's up in the air. You can have common law rules about this. You can have judges making decisions. But the fact is, this teacher strike was so well supported, so overwhelming, that I don't think the law made any difference one way or the other. If teachers would have had a legal right to strike, they would have been protected. But in the absence of any law, I think if judges had tried to interfere in that strike, or administrators tried to fire them for striking, the strike would have persisted. I think they had the strength and numbers to carry that off, regardless of the legal environment.
So do you don't think it would have worked in other places, or is it just because West Virginia is unique?
I don't think West Virginia is unique. I think the situation just came to a head in West Virginia through a variety of circumstances, including, if I've got my facts right, what the legislature did. The governor was willing to give a 5% increase, and then the legislature decided they were going to cut that. They were also going to increase the cost of health insurance. So that precipitated the real crisis in the dispute, if you will. I mean, I understand that to be the reason. And so it's hard to say. These are very particular to what's happening in the state of West Virginia. But I think public employees tend to be fairly strongly organized. They have a union density of about 34%. Private sector union membership is only about 6%, a little above that. So public sector employees can be fairly militant, and they can undertake work actions sometimes when they want to or need to, even if the law is contrary. And that happened in the air traffic controller strike. It's against the law to strike against the government, but they did it. And I think that confrontation in the past, they were successful at doing that, and they got away with it. When it came to Reagan, it didn't work out so well for them.
Well, I'm floored by the 6% in the public forum. That's the only percentage.
That's in the private sector,
yeah.
And what that means is people who work for private industry like coal mines, union membership density overall is very low, and it's been falling for many years. It's been falling, in my opinion, roughly since 1980, during that period right in there.
Wow. Well, I was wondering, do you have anything that you think you would like to add that you think our listeners should know about unions and collective bargaining?
Yes, I would just say the interesting thing to me that there's some indication that wages have now started to grow again, because there's just so much demand out there, so much economic activity. and workers are finally getting wage increases for the first time in many years. Middle class wages are going up. That may or may not continue. I think part of it depends on whether we go back to the period of sort of stagnation. I know Trump comes into office and he says, "Oh, it was so terrible under Obama." But the truth is, wages since 2008, that Great Recession, have actually been growing for workers and growing fairly significantly. It's just right in this last recent period that wages have started to increase more than inflation. So there are actual real wage gains out there now. That hasn't been the case for some period of time, and I think it's because of weaker unions.
Do you think that this is a red-blue thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's red and blue in the sense that this country is badly divided politically, sociologically, economically, if you will. The people who elected Trump were people who came from economically depressed areas, generally speaking. That's not altogether true, but that's the perception. And they came from the Midwest. They came from states which have right-to-work laws. They're politically conservative. So I think there is a big divide, and part of that divide centers on collective bargaining and unions. And if you're from a state where, like Nebraska, where we have these very conservative values, we're not very much in favor of unions. In a state like California, unions are fairly strong and robust. But that's a difference that we have in this country between values and attitudes and culture.
All right. Well, I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little about your book, The End of American Labor Unions, The Right to Work Movement, and the Erosion of Collective Bargaining.
Yes, and that book was really an attempt to trace from the earliest days of this republic, really dating from back in 1806, when there were cases litigated in court dealing with shoemakers, because shoemakers, a craft guild at the time, they were adamant. They said, if anybody is not a member of our society, we won't work with them. So they had this very tight-knit, what amounted to a tight-knit labor organization. Courts began to say, well, we think maybe this is illegal. Maybe it's a conspiracy in restraint of trade. And the American history has been in this sort of anti-worker stance for a long period of time, really up until the Depression and the New Deal. At that time, it begins to change. And when it starts to change, there's this period dating roughly from 1950 where many people in the country are in labor unions. They feel fairly positive toward labor unions. We have an era of prosperity. Middle class starts to thrive. Everything looks good. And a lot of that is attributable to collective bargaining. And then this period of stagflation under Jimmy Carter, many employers started to openly oppose unions, claiming they couldn't afford the wage increases that were demanded. Unions declined from 1980 to 1990 at a more rapid rate than at any time since 1920 to 1930. And the net result is unions are in a much weaker position right now than they have been for years.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have, all the questions we have for you. So I would just like to thank you again for coming on our show.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about my research. That's, academics don't always get much opportunity to try to present what they think in a fairly accessible format. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, we loved having you. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're quite welcome.
Hey listeners, if you like what you hear, you can help us out by funding our efforts and keeping the show ad-free.
You can do that by donating at our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance or by following the link on our website and in our show notes.
You can also show support to our guests by purchasing their books and other works. You can find a list with links on our website under Guest Works.
So that was Dr. Hogler. Very interesting. Very interesting. What I found most fascinating about him was not only was he extremely educated through his research and his work experience, but just his life experience.
Yeah, the fact that he was an arbitrator, that he's actively involved in the process, not just on an academic level, but on a way of putting it to use, those two balances, I think are an important relationship to have,
Yeah. So right to work, Victor.
Do I have a right to work?
I think everybody has a right to work. It's encouraged.
Yeah, I think so. At the heart of right to work laws is that you don't really have to belong. They don't really want you to belong, to say that you have to participate
in a union.
The problem that the Dr. Hogler sees with that is that if you choose not to participate, not only do you just reap the benefits if they do, but it takes away power.
Yeah, well, you're referring to free riders.
Yes.
So free riders, again, are those people that do not participate in unions but reap the benefits of union action.
Yes, but it's a little more than just like, hey, they're getting away with something but not participating. They're taking away the power under right to work laws of the union to be able to petition on behalf of the workers.
Well, yeah, if they're not paying their dues, then the union's not being funded, and if the union's not being funded, then it's being weakened.
And he compared the concept to one was public broadcasting.
Yep.
And then the other one was
taxes. He was talking about taxes, participating in taxes. So
yeah.
we don't get to be free riders with our public things like schools and roads and whatnot. So we benefit from that. When we pay our taxes, we benefit from the roads, and our children benefit from the public schools and the other public things that we have.
So we don't get to use the system, what the system provides, without participating in the system. And he was, I think, implying that the same thing with unions. You can't reap all the benefits without participating in the system. You're still going to be part of that system no matter what. And then under the public broadcasting aspect, it was public broadcasting is out there. And I guess this is sort of the opposing view. Was that what I was gathering? Is that this is public broadcasting is out there. You don't have to pay for it. And it's still going to be out there because people who do want it participate in it.
Until they don't.
Yeah, until they don't. But then it's sort of, this thing is self-sustaining, and this one cannot sustain without participation. So these are the two philosophies, the collectivism versus individualism, right?
Yeah, I want to say that unions might be a little bit different than public broadcasting, only in that public broadcasting isn't really a protectionist kind of thing for a body of people, but more of just something for enjoyment and education.
Like us.
Exactly like us.
It's interesting because I remember, I was really young, but I do remember Reagan and the aircraft traffic controller strike. And I don't, it's not, like I said, I was really young, but I do want to say that, Reagan he was really a larger than life character. And I don't know if it was just unique to him or what, but it really was this sort of, you kind of go along with what he said. I don't know, maybe that's not a good thing to hear when you're talking about your government, since you should always be willing to.
Well, he was an actor.
Yeah. And when Dr. Hogler was saying that, people were just like, well, he's just, he's really well liked. And so people went along with it. And, of course, there's a lot of danger in that. But I do remember that. And I do think that sort of might have been a real sharp decline in the ideas of unions as positive things. And you got that sort of spin after that where it just got worse and worse.
With deunionization, an argument that I've heard, and I've heard a lot of people say this, is in today's age, in today's society, we don't need unions. I think they say that because of a lot of things that have happened because of unions and the state of how we are as the working force today because of union actions. They don't feel that we need unions anymore because we're better off, and that the companies and different corporations will take care of their workers. I don't believe that to be true overall for companies. I know there are some companies out there that really do value their workforce and they do ensure that they are taken care of. But in a business mindset, in a capitalistic mindset, your labor force is a cost. So you want to keep that cost low without being a detriment to the product. So in a business's mindset, you want to pay your workers just enough to keep them working. Not necessarily happy, just working. Unions are a protection for that workforce to give them a collective voice, to ensure that they have the things they need to thrive.
Yeah, I think one of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about that was how businesses in our economy, they're really interested in how the company looks. So if there's anything that they can control to make those costs go down so that the stock value looks more valuable, that's what they're going to do. And, with that in mind, you have this idea that, well, if labor we can pay them a lowest wage, then that's what they're going to do just to keep that stock price looking like, like they're more profitable. So that stock price will be more valuable. And there's, important business reasons behind all of that. But the downside is that if you have a labor force who can't thrive or grow or sustain their own personal economy, then I think you're going to hurt yourself in the long run.
I believe that's called, and he mentioned that productive wealth. So when the workforce has a living wage above, and another thing he said, above inflation. So when workers are being paid more than what inflation is, then we have more productive wealth. And productive wealth is that wealth that is distributed throughout the economy more than the wealth that's given to, the top 5 or 1%. That wealth is pretty much just hoarded. It's not really pushed out in the economy. It doesn't create jobs the way that productive wealth does.
There's a name for that, isn't it?
What's that?
When the wealth that's for the wealthy, what's that called?
Unproductive wealth?
Unproductive wealth. Is that it?
That's what I'd call it.
Yeah. But that's money that's like, even when they do spend it, it's spent on things that only are funneled into a narrower...
Like a niche market?
A niche market, yeah. So, like only 23 guys built a Lamborghini. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but, but that's what I'm saying. It's like if it's 23 guys that build that Lamborghini and the 10 people that are ahead of that company, that's what's going to be benefited. But that doesn't really benefit. It doesn't trickle down. Doesn't really trickle down. How's that sound?
Well, yeah. Trickle down economics. That's for another episode, I believe.
Yeah, but that also stems back into President Reagan, who was this larger than life that in my feelings is when I remember unions starting to be spun in a different light.
That was almost 40 years ago.
Don't rub it in.
The purpose of me saying that is, a lot of people are short-sighted. And we see that in the news a lot. Everybody wants to blame things that are happening today with what has happened just a few years ago. And in some instances, that might be accurate. And with all this deunionization, especially when you talk about, the Wagner Act strengthening unions and then the Taft-Hartley Act weakening unions, this stuff happened years and years ago, decades ago. And we're still feeling the effects of it today.
One of the other things that really stuck out with me was his discussion about wealth inequality in the United States.
Yeah, and Thomas Piketty's research.
Yeah, it always seems to pop back up. And one of the things that really struck me was how he said that our system has a natural tendency to work toward the inequality of wealth. And I found that very powerful to hear,
That might be something that needs to be explored a little bit more. Maybe the reasons why.
And with that, collective bargaining is the only real tool that the working class, the middle class, has to sort of stand against that natural tendency.
I think it's a tool for a balance.
Yeah.
We have businesses that are looking at their bottom line, trying to make as much money as they can, sometimes at the expense of their employees, of their workers. And unions, I believe, are a balancing tool for that. So, the working class, the middle class, those employees have something to use to their benefit and to their protection.
And, when you're talking about how he said that the private sector unions had shrunk to 6% is an alarming number to think about.
Yeah, that does have a little bit of a wow factor.
once again, one of the things I find about our country is that there's always a balance, and things, versus collectivism versus individualism. It's important to have a balance there and how much we address it. And, when we spoke about lobbying and corporate lobbying and things like that, and how they have this power to push their agenda, which, I'm not saying it's some sort of crazy conspiratory thing. I'm just saying they have an agenda, and that they want to push.
And everybody has an agenda.
Yes, everybody has an agenda. And their idea is that if we stay as sort of this individualism philosophy, that you have the right to achieve what you want and you can petition on your own behalf. But they can sell their brand better than individuals can, than regular middle class and working class citizens.
They have a larger voice.
They have a larger voice. They have the finances to back it.
Yeah.
And so then you have the opposite side, which is the collectivism. So we as the working class, that's our only real choice. And if we let this be undermined, there's a question there is will we be able to compete in that environment without that voice?
One of the arguments that those against collectivism and unions say is if we allow unions to push things like, higher wages and health insurance, then it's going to drive the price of everything up, or you're going to put businesses out of business. And that's just not true. It might be true for some businesses, but in those cases, some of those businesses might not be being run very well. And the people that argue this believe in a free market and the hidden hand of the market. Things will balance themselves out. It has shown to be true throughout history.
I have, many friends from all walks of life, and they all have different philosophies. And one of the things that, that I'm frequently saying is that if you close the door to anything, you're going to end up it's just going to be, you're going to live in an echo chamber. And I think the problem is that we live in this idea of that there has to be these extremes. And the balance should be about the ability to talk to one another. And so, yeah, if there's a chance that a company might not be able to be successful because the employees are demanding too much, then they should be willing to talk to the employees about said event. And the employees should be willing to be able to talk to their employers about not being able to survive. And I think, the logical place to do that is unions. The doorway can go both ways.
Well, with that being said, listeners, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, get back with us. Let us know.
Yeah.
Social media, guys.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts, your opinions, your experiences with unions, or, are you for or against? Let us know. We really like to start a dialogue.
Tag us on Twitter.
And Facebook.
Let us know. You can tag us on Instagram if you want and post things out there too.
Yeah. We'd like to give a special thanks to Stu Art and Design for our show's logos and to Kiko's Last Smile for the music you've heard during the show.
We would also like to thank our guests for their time and insight, and a thank you to our listeners. Without you, this isn't possible.
Show your support by donating at our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance, and head over to our website for a full listing of our episodes, transcripts, and more information about our guests and other supporters.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Links are in the show notes and on our website.
And if you're so inclined, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, tell people about us. I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And I'm Victor Polino, and you've been listening to Civil Dissonance, a Pro Thoughts production.
Now go out and start a conversation.
I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty good.